I had planned for this hike to be a peaceful, solo winter getaway. I had been hiking in this area before, and while it's not a particularly busy trail, I didn't mind the solitude. It was a Tuesday in February, which meant the snow-covered trails were mostly empty. I loved the quiet, the crisp air, and the way the world seemed to pause when I stepped into the forest. No one else was around, which I found oddly comforting. The solitude felt like a retreat, a chance to reconnect with nature and myself. The trail wasn't easy, but I had been here enough times to know what to expect. There were icy patches, deep snow drifts in places, and narrow stretches that were tricky when covered in a fresh layer of snow. But none of it fazed me. I had all the right gear, crampons, trekking poles, layers of clothing that I could add or shed as needed. I even had my trusty Gatorade in my pack, some snacks, and a good supply of water. It was going to be a simple out-and-back hike, about 10 kilometers in total, which I planned to do in about 3 to 4 hours. It was late in the morning when I set off, and the sun was still low in the sky, casting long, pale shadows through the trees. By the time I had made it 5 kilometers out, I was feeling good. The air was cold, but it wasn't bitter, and the snow underfoot was packed down enough that I didn't sink with every step. I was pushing forward with a comfortable pace, enjoying the quiet and the beauty of the forest. The trees stood bare, their branches heavy with frost, and the snow was pristine, untouched by human tracks. It was almost magical, this stillness, like the world had taken a deep breath and was waiting to exhale. But then it hit me. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, a little wave of dizziness that I could easily brush off as the usual tiredness from hiking. But it didn't go away. It deepened. My legs began to feel weak. My arms felt as though they were filled with lead. The dizziness turned into a kind of fuzzy confusion, a sense of vertigo that made me stumble a little, my trekking poles feeling less steady against the snow. My heart rate picked up, and I felt like I couldn't focus on anything. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I couldn't tell which direction I was facing. I knew right away what was happening. My blood sugar was crashing. I'd been type 1 diabetic for most of my life, and I was used to managing it on the go. But this was different. I had made sure to eat breakfast before heading out. I packed plenty of snacks, bananas, raisins, and Gatorade for just this kind of situation. Still, no matter how prepared I thought I was, it always felt like my body could catch me off guard. The reality of my situation hit me quickly. I was 5 kilometers from my car. The trail was icy and treacherous in places, and I was already feeling the cold creeping in. The last thing I needed was to slip and fall, or worse, pass out somewhere in the middle of nowhere. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my snacks. I took the Gatorade from my pack, unscrewing the lid with shaking fingers, and took a long drink. The sweetness and the electrolytes hit me, but it wasn't enough. I needed more, something to help pull me out of the fog in my head. I grabbed the banana next, peeling it as quickly as I could and taking a few bites. It wasn't much, but I knew it was a start. The raisins came after that, one small handful at a time, and I could feel my heart rate slowly dropping. I didn't have the luxury of waiting for my body to recover entirely before moving, though. The longer I stayed still, the worse I would feel, and I was still too far out to just sit down and wait for help. I had to keep moving. The thought of sitting down was tempting, but I couldn't let myself. It was so easy to imagine the worst-case scenario, falling into a hypoglycemic episode and losing consciousness. I couldn't let that happen. I had to push forward. So I made myself get back on the trail. My legs were shaky, and my balance was off, but I managed to get a few more steps in. I had to focus on my breath, steady and deep, to keep myself grounded. The feeling of vertigo lingered, and my hands were still trembling, but I was moving. I didn't look back. I had no idea how much time had passed, but every minute felt like a small eternity. The trail seemed longer than it had on the way out, and the snow seemed deeper, more treacherous. I had to concentrate hard to keep my footing. One wrong step and I could fall. The trail was slippery, the ice hidden beneath the snow, and I had to make every step count. I focused on each step, each breath, and just kept moving. After what felt like hours, I reached the point where the trail narrowed and the footing got trickier. The snow was deeper here, and it was clear I was getting closer to the more difficult parts of the trail. I could feel my energy draining away, the aftereffects of the crash still weighing on me. My muscles were sore, and every step felt like it required more effort. But the thought of being out there longer, of pushing through even more treacherous ground, was too much. I had to make it back to my car. I had no choice. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but I could feel myself slowly regaining some control over my body. The dizziness was still there, but it was starting to fade. My arms didn't feel quite as heavy, and my legs were slowly coming back to life, though they still felt like jelly. I could hear the crunch of my boots in the snow, the sound more solid now, and I clung to that small sense of reassurance. It took me just over 2 hours to make it back. 2 hours that felt like a lifetime, but I finally reached the point where I could see the trailhead in the distance. I knew I was close. When I reached my car, I nearly collapsed into the seat. I was exhausted, my body shaking, but the relief of being done with the hike was overwhelming. I could feel my blood sugar slowly stabilizing, but the shakes and the tiredness lingered. I let myself sit for a few minutes, just breathing, before I reached for my water bottle and took a deep drink. I knew I had made it. I wasn't going to pass out there in the cold. I wasn't going to be a statistic. The whole hike had been a battle against my own body, a struggle to make sure I didn't fall into something worse. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty, but I'd made it. I kept moving. I kept fighting. And as I sat there in my car, slowly regaining my strength, I couldn't help but think about how easily things could have gone the other way. One wrong move, one missed snack, and I could have ended up in a much darker situation. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that I was safe. I'd made it through, and as I started the car, the hum of the engine warming me, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. I had taken on the challenge, and I had come out on top. I was hiking solo in Glacier National Park, one of my favorite places to be in the mountains. I always found solace in the deep silence of the wild, the way the air smelled of pine and earth, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. But that day, something felt different. Maybe it was the clouds hanging low in the sky, or maybe it was just the feeling of being entirely alone in such a massive place, with no one for miles in any direction. I was prepared, though. My pack was light, just enough to get me through the day with some snacks, water, and a noisemaker strapped to the outside. I'd always carry one, a simple whistle, loud enough to startle any animal that got too curious. A little extra precaution never hurt, especially when you're out here by yourself. I had been on the trail for about 3 hours, moving at a steady pace along a narrow path that ran parallel to one of the many pristine lakes Glacier is known for. The water was still, reflecting the jagged peaks around it like a perfect mirror. The occasional breeze would send ripples across the surface, breaking the illusion of calm, but it always returned to its original state almost immediately. I loved how peaceful it was, how isolated it felt. The only sounds were my footsteps on the dirt and the occasional bird call that echoed in the distance. I had planned this solo hike for weeks. There's something about being alone in nature that feels different than when you're with a group. It's the kind of quiet that settles into your bones, that allows you to really think about everything or nothing at all. There were no distractions, no deadlines, no one asking what's next. Just me, the trail, and the wilderness. As I rounded a bend in the path, the lake came into full view, stretching out wide in front of me. I stopped for a moment, taking it all in. The water shimmered, and the mountains rose sharply on the other side, their peaks disappearing into the clouds. The area felt almost surreal, like something out of a dream. I was mesmerized, too caught up in the beauty to realize I was standing at the edge of a stretch of dense brush. It was thick and low, just a few feet away from where the trail led up the lakeshore. Then, as if from nowhere, a sound came from the brush. It was soft at first, the rustling of leaves and branches moving, something large shifting through the undergrowth. I froze, a chill running down my spine. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind. I had heard animals in the woods before, but this sound was different. It was deliberate. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively reached for the noisemaker attached to my pack. I had just grasped the whistle when the brush in front of me suddenly parted, and a massive figure emerged into the open. I could barely believe my eyes. A moose, a full-grown bull moose. It stood there, just 10 or 15 feet away from me, its enormous body blocking my path. I felt my breath catch in my chest. Its dark brown fur glistened in the weak sunlight, and the antlers were like something from another era, wide and branching out like a tree. The moose didn't seem to notice me at first. It stood there, head down, grazing on the foliage at its feet. I stood perfectly still, unsure of what to do. I could feel my pulse in my ears, but I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want to move, not even a little bit. I had heard of people getting too close to moose, how dangerous they could be when they felt threatened. For what seemed like an eternity, I just watched. The moose lifted its head slowly, its large brown eyes locking onto mine. It stood perfectly still, just staring. Time seemed to freeze. The world fell silent around us, the wind dying down, the birds stopping their calls, and even the lake seemed to hold its breath. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat in my chest, thumping wildly against the quiet. Then, without warning, the moose turned its massive head and began to walk, slow and deliberate, towards the water's edge. It didn't break eye contact with me, its gaze heavy, almost as if it were considering me, assessing whether I was a threat. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to move. The moose's footsteps were almost imperceptible on the soft earth as it made its way to the lake. I could hear the water sloshing gently as the moose stepped into it, its legs sinking slightly into the soft lake bed. It didn't rush, just moved with a slow, almost regal grace, completely unaware of how much its presence had stunned me. I stood there, still as a statue, as the moose waded deeper into the water. It was an incredible sight. The sheer size of it was overwhelming, and yet there was something peaceful about the way it moved, as if it had all the time in the world. I had read about moose and heard stories, but nothing had prepared me for this. I was witnessing something ancient and primal, the kind of thing you read about in books or see in documentaries. But here I was, standing in its presence, just a few feet away, watching as it disappeared into the water like some giant, serene creature from another time. I didn't dare move until the moose was out of sight, its large form vanishing into the haze of the mist rising from the lake. Only then did I take a deep breath, exhaling the tension that had built up in my chest. My legs felt weak beneath me, and I slowly sat down on a nearby rock to steady myself. The whole encounter had felt surreal, like something out of a dream. It wasn't exactly terrifying, but there was an undeniable sense of awe, of being in the presence of something so much larger and more powerful than myself. After a few minutes, I picked myself up and continued down the trail, my steps a little more cautious now. I still had a long way to go before reaching my campsite for the night, but I couldn't shake the image of that moose from my mind. It was a reminder of how wild and unpredictable nature could be. You can prepare all you want, but in the end, you're just another part of the landscape, just another animal in the woods trying to find your way through it all. The rest of my hike that day was relatively uneventful, though I couldn't help but keep my eyes on the brush around me. It was hard not to think about the moose or any other creatures that might be lurking nearby. The air had a heaviness to it now, the kind of stillness that makes you wonder if you're being watched. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford to be scared, not out here. The wilderness had a way of humbling you, of reminding you that you were just a small part of something much bigger. I reached my campsite by late afternoon, a quiet spot tucked away in a small grove of trees near the edge of the lake. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the water. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in for the night. The crackle of the flames was comforting, and the warmth from the fire chased away the lingering chill from the evening air. As I sat there, watching the stars begin to prick the sky, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over me. The kind of peace you only find when you're alone, completely immersed in the wilderness. That night, as I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, I couldn't stop thinking about the moose. The encounter was something I would never forget, not just because of how close I had been, but because it was a reminder that, For all the power we like to believe we have, the wilderness is always in control. I was just a visitor here, a fleeting presence in a world that had been around long before me and would continue on long after I was gone. As I lay in my sleeping bag, the sounds of the forest began to take over. The wind rustled through the trees, a distant owl called out into the night, and somewhere, off in the distance, the faint sound of water lapping against the shore reached my ears. The night was peaceful, but I knew it wasn't without its dangers. There were creatures out there, just as there had been earlier in the day. Bears, wolves, moose. Animals that would go about their lives without a second thought to me. But I felt safe in that moment. There was something about the isolation, the quiet, that made me feel like I was part of something much bigger. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, the possibility of encountering something dangerous. It was the understanding that nature, in all its rawness, had its own rhythm. And sometimes, when you're lucky enough, you get to witness that rhythm, to be a part of it, even if just for a moment. That's what makes it all worth it. The next morning, I packed up my camp, ready to continue my journey. The sun had risen early, casting a soft, golden light over the landscape. As I took my first steps onto the trail, I looked back at the lake one last time, the water now calm and peaceful, reflecting the mountains in the distance. It was a beautiful place, one I would never forget. And I knew that, no matter where I went next, the memory of that moose would stay with me, reminding me that even in the most tranquil moments, the wild is always just around the corner. It was one of those days in Southern California when the Santa Ana winds seemed to swallow up all the moisture in the air, leaving the landscape feeling brittle and dry. I had been hiking for years, taking countless trips out to the trails of SoCal, never really thinking about the risks that came with the dry heat and the intense gusts that whipped through the hills. But on this particular day, everything felt different. The wind howled through the canyon, tugging at my hat and kicking up dust with every step I took. It felt like walking through an oven, the kind that heats up the air so much that it almost takes your breath away. I was with a friend that day, but we didn't speak much. We were both too focused on the heat and the trail ahead. The brush on the side of the trail was dry and crunchy, and every time we bumped into it, it snapped in a way that made me shiver. There wasn't a single drop of moisture left anywhere. The sound of the wind was deafening, but there was something else in the air. A smell, a sense of something not quite right, though I couldn't put my finger on it at first. We had been hiking for several hours and were nearing the crest of a ridge. I looked out toward the horizon, where the dry hills of Southern California stretched on forever. The landscape, usually so green in the spring, was now a dull brown, cracked and thirsty. The wind carried the scent of the earth, but there was something else, a faint, acrid tinge that caught my attention. I paused for a moment, squinting into the distance. That's when I saw it. A thin plume of smoke rising in the air, not far from the trail. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the heat, the kind of shimmering distortion you sometimes see when the ground is baking in the sun. But as I stared harder, I realized it wasn't just heat haze. It was real smoke, thick and dark, rising from what seemed to be somewhere along the trail we had just passed. I turned to my friend. "Do you see that?" He nodded, his face going pale. We both stood there for a moment, watching as the smoke swirled and climbed higher. It was a strange sight because it seemed to be coming from both ahead of us on the trail and from the direction of the car, which was parked at the trailhead a few miles back. The realization hit me hard and fast. If that smoke was coming from near the trailhead, it meant that the fire was moving in our direction. It meant that we were trapped. I felt the adrenaline spike in my chest. My heart began to race, and I took a quick breath. We need to move. Now. Without saying anything more, we turned and started running back the way we came. The ground beneath our feet felt like it was baking in the heat, and the wind stung my skin like it had teeth. The dry brush on the sides of the trail was like kindling, ready to go up in flames with the slightest spark. My thoughts were a blur. I couldn't think straight, only the need to get back to the car, to get out of there. As we sprinted, the air grew thick with the smell of smoke, stronger with each step we took. It was a heavy, oppressive smell that settled in the back of my throat, burning it with each breath. We passed familiar landmarks on the trail, but everything felt foreign now. The dry bushes and trees that had once been part of the landscape seemed more menacing, like they were ready to explode at any moment. The sound of the wind howling through the canyon grew louder, and the smoke thickened, billowing like a storm cloud in the distance. We didn't speak, didn't look at each other. There was only the pounding of our feet on the dry earth and the sharp sting of the smoke in our eyes. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, the terror that I'd never been in a situation like this before. I had always known that wildfires were a danger in Southern California, but they had always seemed distant, something that happened to other people somewhere far away. But now, here we were, the fire closing in, and all I could think about was getting to safety. We ran for what felt like forever, but when I glanced over at my friend, I saw the same panic in his eyes. We were both starting to slow down, our bodies screaming for a break, but we couldn't stop. Not now. I had hiked these trails 100 times, maybe more, but never once had I felt this kind of fear. The Santa Ana winds had always been just part of the landscape, a force of nature that made the air dry but never seemed like a threat. But today, everything was different. The ground was too dry, the air too thick, the smoke too close. Finally, we rounded a bend, and there it was, the car parked just ahead. I felt a surge of relief, the kind you only experience when you've come to the edge of something terrible and seen the way out. But as we ran toward it, I realized we weren't out of danger yet. The smoke was closer now, so close that I could feel the heat on my skin. The wind was carrying it toward us, the dry brush along the trail ready to catch fire at any moment. We reached the car and threw open the doors, not even bothering to unlock them. I jumped in, slamming the door shut behind me, and immediately started the engine. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, but I didn't waste any time. I put the car in gear and drove, my foot heavy on the gas, wanting nothing more than to get out of there. The smoke was thick now, a dark cloud hanging in the sky behind us. As I sped down the winding road that led back toward the main highway, I could see the fire in the distance, moving fast. It was moving toward the trailhead, toward where we had just been. I didn't know how far the fire had spread, but I knew it wasn't safe to stop. We didn't speak for a long time. The car was filled with the smell of smoke, and the heat outside was unbearable. The air in the car felt thick, like I was breathing through a cloth. I kept my eyes on the road, watching for any signs of danger ahead, but all I could think about was how close we had come to being caught. I had never considered, in all my years of hiking in Southern California, that a wildfire could put me in danger like this. It was always just something you heard about on the news, something that happened to other people. But today it had been too close. I didn't know how long the fire would burn or where it would go, but I knew I didn't want to find out. We made it out of the hills and onto the highway, where the air was a little clearer. I slowed the car down, still shaken, but at least we were safe. I looked over at my friend, who was staring out the window, his face pale. Neither of us spoke for a while, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavily between us. When we finally pulled over to the side of the road, I couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had changed. How quickly something as innocent as a hike could turn into a race for survival. I had taken it all for granted before, the beauty of the desert, the quiet of the mountains. But now I knew how easily it could all be swallowed up by the flames. We were lucky, I knew that. We had gotten out in time, but others might not be so fortunate. I thought about the hikers still out on the trail, those who hadn't seen the smoke, those who didn't know the danger was so close. I thought about how quickly the fire could spread, how fast the dry air and the wind could turn a normal hike into a life and death situation. As the day began to cool, the smoke still hanging in the air, I realized that I would never look at the trails in Southern California the same way again. I had always known that the landscape was harsh, that the desert was unforgiving. But now I understood just how quickly it could turn deadly. The Santa Ana winds weren't just a nuisance, they were a warning. And from now on, I would never take the danger of wildfires lightly again. We didn't go back to the trail. We didn't need to. What we had just escaped was enough, and I was content, for the first time, to leave the hills behind. It had been a long day of driving through the backroads of Oregon, following the twisting, turning paths that led me deeper into the heart of nature. The air was fresh, the sun was still a little too warm for late September, and I had the whole place to myself. I couldn't have asked for a better spot to set up camp. The secluded little lake near the base of Three Sisters was perfect. The water was still, mirroring the towering peaks and the thick trees surrounding the site. There were no other vehicles nearby, no signs of other campers. Just the quiet, peaceful solitude I had been craving. I was car camping, but I kept it simple. The small tent I brought was a one-person model, small enough that I could throw it together in minutes. I always enjoyed the challenge of setting up my camp, finding the right spot to sleep where the ground was flat, but not so flat that water would collect in the night. The tent was right next to the water, maybe 20 feet from the edge, and I made sure to clear the area of rocks or debris that could poke through the floor. I left my gear in the back of my car, mostly just a few bags of food, a hatchet, and a small fire starting kit. I kept the fire low, not wanting to attract too much attention. The first part of the evening was perfect. I ate a quick meal, enjoying the solitude, watching the stars come out as the last traces of sunlight faded. The air grew cooler, and the forest around me became even quieter, save for the occasional rustle of a distant animal. I felt at ease, completely at peace in my little corner of the world. After cleaning up, I slid into my sleeping bag and zipped myself into the tent, snug and warm. I had no plans to go anywhere the next day, so I allowed myself to sink into the quiet. I drifted off to sleep without any trouble, lulled by the faint sound of the water lapping gently against the shore. That's when it happened. I was awoken in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the typical sounds of nature that normally kept me on edge. No, this was something different, something closer. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was a sound from my dream that was still lingering. But no, there was something outside. The low murmur of voices. Not loud, not quite whispers, but unmistakably voices. It sounded like two people, but they weren't talking like they were having a normal conversation. It was soft, as if they were trying to keep their voices down. My heart rate started to pick up. I strained to listen, my ears keen and focused. The voices were just a few feet away, maybe 6, close enough that I could hear every rustle of clothing, every slight shift in their stance. I lay there, frozen. My tent was small, way too small. I could barely move without brushing the walls of the fabric. I felt exposed, so vulnerable. They were so close. I glanced at the ground next to me, my hand instinctively reaching out to touch the hatchet I had left on the ground beside my tent. But it wasn't there. My heart stopped for a second. I realized with a jolt that I had left it sitting outside, right where they were standing. I didn't have any weapons or tools within reach, nothing that could help me if they decided to come in. Panic started creeping up my spine, but I fought to keep it under control. I took a slow breath, listening intently. The voices were still there, but the words were too muffled for me to make out. Were they talking to each other? Were they looking for something or someone? I thought about moving, but the idea of making noise and alerting them to my presence made me even more afraid. The last thing I wanted was for them to realize I was awake, and that I was alone. Alone in the middle of nowhere with no one around for miles. I could barely hear them shifting around, moving from one spot to the next, and all I could do was lie there, straining to hear their next move. The coldness in my stomach spread as I realized just how much of an easy target I was. I was alone, with no one around to help if things went sideways. The tent was just a flimsy barrier against the outside world. I had to stay still. I had to wait them out. Time seemed to drag on. The voices weren't growing louder, but the silence between them seemed to stretch on forever. I tried to stay calm, to steady my breath. I focused on the sound of the night around me. The wind picking up in the trees, the occasional chirp of a cricket in the distance, the soft, steady sound of the water lapping at the shore. But even those familiar noises felt alien, muted by the fear that had settled deep inside me. After what felt like an eternity, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was thick, like the world had held its breath. I kept listening, straining my ears, trying to hear any movement. Had they heard me? Did they know I was awake? Then, finally, the sound of footsteps. Soft, cautious, but distinct. They were moving away from the tent, back toward the trees. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't turn back, hoping they wouldn't come closer. But slowly, they faded into the night. The footsteps grew quieter and quieter until they were gone. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing. What had just happened? Were those guys just out for a walk, stumbling around in the dark for fun? Or were they up to something more? I couldn't be sure, and my mind kept running through every worst-case scenario. The sound of the wind in the trees didn't help. Every gust seemed to carry some new threat. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I finally drifted back to sleep, though it was a restless sleep, with my eyes flickering open at every sound. By morning, the sun was already rising, casting light across the water and illuminating the trees in warm golden hues. The camp was quiet again, and I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. I decided to pack up early and get moving. I needed to shake off the feeling that had clung to me since the night. I didn't know if those two guys had been harmless, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The thought of them lingering around my campsite, even in the daylight, was unsettling. I made sure to leave no trace of my presence, packing everything into my car and heading back down the road. The beautiful lake, the quiet solitude. It was all still there, untouched by whatever had happened during the night. It was hard to say if I'd ever camp alone in such a secluded place again. Part of me still wanted that sense of peace and isolation, but another part was wary. I couldn't shake the feeling that, had I done something differently, had I made a sound or moved too suddenly, I might have found myself in a much worse situation. Looking back, I'm sure those two guys were just a couple of stoners, maybe out for a midnight stroll, stumbling around, lost in the beauty of the night. But at the time, it was terrifying. The fear of the unknown, of not knowing who was out there in the dark with you, can make even the most beautiful places feel like a trap. And in that moment, with nothing but a thin fabric between me and the world outside, I realized just how vulnerable I had been. But the thing is, that's part of the wilderness, isn't it? It can be peaceful, serene, and quiet, but it's also unpredictable. There's always something that can catch you off guard. And that night, something did. But by morning, I knew that I'd made it through. And as I drove away, the beauty of Three Sisters was still there, untouched, the threat of the night fading with each mile. We decided to do a winter backpacking trip in the Laurel Highlands. The plan was to head out for a few days, explore the woods, get some fresh air, and push ourselves in a way we hadn't before. The thing is, none of us really understood just how grueling winter hiking could be. We were used to summer trips where the biggest worry was heat and dehydration, but this time it was going to be different. The morning we set out, there was practically no snow at the trailhead, just a light dusting. It was barely enough to cover the ground, and I remember thinking we had overpacked for the trip. We weren't expecting much snow at all, so we just geared up in layers, figuring we'd be fine. It wasn't long before we started descending into the valleys, and the snow started to deepen, inch by inch, until it reached our shins. It was about 2 miles in when we realized what a huge mistake we'd made. The snow, while pretty, wasn't just deep, it was heavy. The kind of snow that sticks to your boots and drags you down with every step. At first, it was almost fun, laughing as we trudged through it, joking about how real this hike was. But as time passed, we started taking turns plowing through the snow. It got worse as we got lower, each step a little harder than the last, and the weight of it on my legs became unbearable. We weren't making progress, at least not at the pace we had hoped. My buddies were just as wiped out as I was, but they kept pushing forward. I knew we weren't exactly in trouble yet, but every step felt like we were fighting the snow and our own exhaustion. The cold was creeping in, and I could feel it in my bones. Every time I stopped for a breather, it felt like the temperature dropped a few degrees. My fingers were stiff, and I noticed that I was barely able to get my backpack open without a struggle. My legs were sore, and my mind started to feel foggy, the way it does when you're just too tired to think straight. Finally, we made it to the campsite. It was one of the approved spots, but that didn't make it feel any less remote. There were no other campers around. Not a soul. It was just the three of us, surrounded by nothing but trees and snow. It felt wrong, almost like the woods had swallowed everyone else up. Setting up camp was more difficult than I expected. By then, it was already late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The light was already fading fast. We were still cold, and none of us could stop shivering. I knew we needed to get a fire going before the temperatures dropped even more. But when we tried to start one, nothing seemed to go right. We had all the gear, a lighter, kindling, fire starter, and the rest, but we couldn't get a spark. One of the guys was so tired he just collapsed into his sleeping bag, barely making a sound. The other guy, Mark, was struggling to feel his feet. It was clear he had been pushing himself harder than he should have. He was the type of guy who would never admit to being cold or hurt, but now I could see it in his eyes. His feet were red, and the skin looked like it might crack open. I had to do something. I didn't know what, but I knew that we couldn't just sit there and freeze. The cold was getting worse by the minute. I started crawling around the campsite, searching for anything that could help. Finally, under one of the Adirondack chairs, I found a stick that seemed semi-dry. It wasn't much, but it was something. I spent what felt like forever feathering it down, working with what little I could find. I was literally crawling under the chairs and scrubbing through the snow for dry leaves, twigs, anything to get a spark. It was the kind of desperation I had never felt before. I thought about calling for help, but that felt like a last resort. A failure, a sign that we hadn't prepared properly. Somehow, after what felt like forever, I managed to get a small ember going. It was tiny, barely visible in the dim light, but it was enough. From there, it was just a matter of carefully feeding the ember with small twigs and kindling. I blew on it gently, as if my breath alone could will it to life. Slowly, the fire started to grow. I kept feeding it, almost obsessively, until the flames were big enough to provide some warmth. I remember sitting there in front of that fire, hands trembling as I held them near the warmth, feeling the slow return of feeling to my fingers and toes. The fire wasn't just warmth. It was relief, the first real relief we'd felt since the hike began. We ate some dried food we had packed, simple stuff, trail mix, energy bars, but the fire made everything feel better. Mark, who had been complaining about his feet, managed to wiggle his toes and told us they were starting to feel better. Slowly, we began to warm up, but I don't think I've ever felt so weak in my life. The fire was keeping us alive in a way. It wasn't a luxury, it was a lifeline. Looking back, I realized just how much that situation could have turned out differently. We had no idea how difficult it was going to be. There was a moment, as I sat there in front of the fire, feeling it eat through the cold air, when I thought that I might need to call for rescue. We weren't exactly in danger yet, but if we hadn't gotten that fire going, things could have taken a turn for the worse. I could barely remember what I had in my pack, and the thought of calling for help crossed my mind, even though I knew it might make me feel like a failure. It wasn't until later that night, after we'd gotten the fire going and we were all finally feeling normal again, that I remembered the stove. I had a stove in my backpack. The whole time, I had been so cold, so desperate, that I couldn't think of the simplest solution. If I had remembered that stove sooner, we could have had a warm meal much earlier. We could have avoided all the suffering. But I didn't remember it, and in that moment, I felt stupid. My mind had just gone blank. I think the cold and hunger had done something to my brain, and for a while I couldn't even think straight. That night, we didn't talk much. We just sat around the fire, huddling close. The temperature dropped even more, and we made sure to keep the fire burning through the night. As I lay there in my sleeping bag, I could hear the crackling of the fire, and every now and then, I would catch myself thinking that it should have been easier. We should have been better prepared. But that's the thing about winter hiking. You don't know what's coming until you're in it. In the morning, the snow was still thick. It had snowed more overnight, and the world around us was covered in a blanket of white. We packed up our camp in silence, each of us a little worse for wear. Mark's feet were still sore, but he could move again. The fire had saved us, but we knew we couldn't rely on it forever. We had to keep moving or we'd be stuck there for who knows how long. When we finally made it back to the trailhead, the feeling of the warm car waiting for us was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. I think the cold does something to you. It makes you realize how fragile you are, how easy it is to slip from comfort into danger. That's what we had come so close to. Just a few more mistakes, and we might not have made it out of those woods. It was a trip that reminded me how dangerous the outdoors can be when you're not fully prepared. And it was a trip that left me with a feeling of respect for nature that I hadn't truly understood before. We made it out, but the lesson I took away wasn't about how strong we were or how much we had overcome. It was about how close we had come to not making it out at all. It was one of those crisp, clear winter days in New Hampshire, the kind that makes the air feel like it's been scrubbed clean and the snow-covered peaks look impossibly still. The kind of day you dream about when you're stuck at work, wishing you could be out in the mountains. I had been planning this hike for weeks, and I was finally here, standing at the base of one of New Hampshire's 4,000-footers. It had been a winter hike I'd been anticipating, and for good reason. The trail had been a challenge every time we'd hiked it before, and today wouldn't be any different. I was with my hiking buddy, an experienced guy who had hiked in winter more times than I could count. Between the two of us, we knew the dangers and had the gear to match. Full pack, microspikes, poles, the whole setup. We weren't taking any chances. We'd been hiking together on the toughest trails for years, and I trusted him like a brother when it came to tackling rough terrain. We'd done a few winter hikes together, enough that we both understood how serious it could get, and how quickly the mountains could turn from peaceful to deadly. The trail started off pretty mellow, winding through the dense woods where the trees had started to thin as we ascended. The snow was deep, powdery in some parts, compacted in others. But as we got higher up, we could feel the difference in the air, the temperature dropping steadily, the wind picking up. The sun was low in the sky, casting a long shadow over the land and making everything feel quieter, more distant. The trees started to thin out, opening up the views as the trail grew steeper. We knew this was when things would start to get tricky. At the higher elevations, the mountains start to really show their true face. They don't just slope gently anymore. They drop off steeply, and the rocks are exposed, covered in ice. Winter here is a different beast entirely. When the trees thinned out, the snow and ice on the trail became more treacherous. You can see everything ahead of you, but that's also the problem. You can see the danger. It's right there in front of you, just waiting for you to slip, fall, or make a mistake. We came upon one of those ice sheets not long after. It was a section of the trail that cut across a large rock face, but in the winter, that rock face was covered by a massive sheet of ice. The kind that looked like a frozen waterfall, slick and shiny under the low sun. The ice stretched out ahead of us, reflecting the light in a way that made it look almost beautiful, but we both knew better. There was a small jump we had to make, from one part of the trail down to the ice. It was a gap, maybe a foot wide, and not that far down, but it was enough to make you think. I watched my buddy go first, making it look easy, his microspikes digging into the snow and ice. Then it was my turn. I could see the ice ahead, glistening under the sunlight. I could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of the mountain, the weight of the snow and the ice all pressing down on me. But I was ready. I stepped forward, adjusting my poles, and prepared to make the jump. But as soon as I hit the ice with my microspikes, everything went wrong. One moment I was standing, the next my feet were out from under me, and I was sliding uncontrollably down the slope. I don't know how it happened. I didn't expect it. I didn't feel anything shift beneath me. It was like I was on a slip and slide that had been laid out across a mountain. First, it was just a jolt, a sudden shock as my body was jerked forward, and then the panic set in. I tried to stop myself, tried to dig in my poles, but there was no traction. My feet were up in the air, and all I could do was brace for impact. I felt the cold sting of the ice on my rear, the sudden whiplash of the speed building up, and the terrifying thought that I might not stop in time. I slid further and further, my body jolting as I hit bumps and uneven patches in the ice. It felt like I was moving in slow motion, but in reality, It was happening so fast that my mind could barely keep up. My feet hit nothing but ice. The sharp, unnatural sound of my microspikes scraping against the slick surface. And then, just as I was starting to think I might slide right off the edge of the mountain, I felt myself heading toward the drop. The sheer drop. I couldn't see exactly how far down it was, but I knew from the way the ice sloped that I was heading straight for a drop that could easily kill me if I kept going. I think my brain shut down for a second. I just knew I needed to stop. Somehow, any way I could. I had a split second to think, and in that moment, it felt like my entire life was flashing before my eyes. And then, like some sort of miracle, I felt myself slide between two stunted trees, their branches barely hanging on against the wind. I reached out without thinking, instinctively grabbing each tree with both hands, and that's what stopped me. My feet were still dangling in the air, inches from the edge, but I was stopped. I was alive. I had barely avoided going over. I didn't move at first. I just sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to collect myself. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. I was shaken, not knowing whether to laugh or scream. It was like I had cheated death by mere inches. "Hey, you good?" My buddy's voice was loud in the silence. He must have heard my slip, but he couldn't see what had happened. "I'm good," I yelled back, still sitting between those two trees. "Just give me a sec." Took a minute for me to steady my breathing to get my thoughts back. I wasn't out of danger yet. I was still on that slope, still close to that drop. One wrong move and I could slide again, and this time I wouldn't have any trees to stop me. I slowly started to move, inching my way up the slope, using the trees for leverage. It wasn't easy, and it was slow, but after what felt like an eternity, I finally managed to get enough traction to pull myself off the ice and back onto safer ground. My body felt like it was on fire from the exertion, but I didn't care. I was alive. I was on solid ground again. Once I was out of immediate danger, I took a moment to just sit and calm down, catching my breath. The fear was still there, pulsing in my chest, but I knew I had to get my head back in the game. I could hear my buddy calling up to me again. "Everything okay?" I took another breath, then stood up, brushing the snow off my pants. I had to admit I was shaken, but I wasn't going to let it stop me. "Yeah," I called back. "I'm good. Just needed a minute." I stood there for a moment, looking at the drop I had almost gone over, thinking about how close I had come to falling, how quickly everything had turned from a beautiful, peaceful winter hike into something so much more dangerous. I was still aware of the ice beneath me, the steep slope that continued ahead, and the path that would lead to the summit. We continued on, and though I could tell my buddy was a little more cautious now, we made it to the summit without any more major incidents. It wasn't the hike I'd imagined. I had wanted to reach the top, feel that sense of accomplishment, and look out over the vast white wilderness below. But that moment, that terrifying slide, would stay with me far longer than the summit ever would. The rest of the hike was quieter, more deliberate. We didn't talk much, just focused on our footing, making sure we took it slow and steady. When we finally reached the summit, I took in the view, but it wasn't the same. I'd been here before, but now all I could think about was that near miss. I had come so close to losing everything. It took a while for the fear to fade, for my body to stop shaking, but it did. Eventually, we made our way down slowly, and as we descended the mountain, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the trail. Everything felt quieter, more peaceful, but in the back of my mind, that slide, that terrifying moment, kept replaying in my head. That day didn't end with any grand celebration or excitement. It just ended with the quiet relief of making it back to the trailhead, where we both sat on a bench for a moment, letting the weight of what had happened sink in. It was a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong in the mountains. One slip, one mistake, and it could all be over. I had been lucky, but I wasn't going to forget that lesson. That day, I learned the hard way that you don't get to pick when your luck runs out in the mountains. You just have to hope you're ready when it does. We landed in Montana that summer with a sense of adventure in our bones. my girlfriend, my sister, and I had been talking about visiting the state for months, planning out all the hikes, camping trips, and scenic drives we could possibly fit in. It was one of those perfect days, bright, sunny, and warm. The skies were clear, and there wasn't a single cloud in sight. We were all a bit giddy, still feeling the excitement of the trip and the rush of being in a new place. As soon as we stepped off the plane, we didn't waste a second. We gathered our bags, hopped into the rental car, and drove straight to the trailhead. It was about 1 p.m. by the time we made it there, and the sun was high, casting long shadows over the forest as we pulled up to the parking lot. We hadn't even bothered to check the weather for the day, confident that it would stay clear for the rest of our hike. It was July after all. What could go wrong? We started down the trail with light hearts and even lighter steps, the air dry and the woods around us peaceful. The trail was well marked and wide enough for all three of us to walk side by side. Birds sang from the trees, and we could hear the faint rustling of leaves as the wind picked up in gentle gusts. The forest smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and it was easy to forget we were miles away from any city. For the first 2 miles, everything was perfect. The trail twisted through dense trees, and the sun filtered through the canopy in patches of golden light. We passed a few other hikers, but it wasn't crowded, just a few families and couples out enjoying the wilderness. The trail was steep in some spots, but nothing too challenging. We were all in good spirits, taking our time, talking and laughing as we went. Montana was everything we hoped it would be. It wasn't until we reached a clearing that things started to change. The sky overhead began to shift from its brilliant blue to something a little more overcast, though not enough to cause concern. I could feel the temperature drop slightly, and I looked at my sister. She glanced up at the sky and shrugged. "We should probably turn around if it starts to drizzle," she said, as if it were an afterthought. I nodded, not thinking too much of it. The weather was still holding, and there was no reason to be cautious. But something in the back of my mind told me to keep an eye on the sky. Then it happened. A loud boom echoed through the trees. At first, I thought it was just thunder in the distance, the kind of rumble that came from a storm that was still miles away, not close enough to be dangerous, but close enough to remind you that nature could turn quickly. I glanced at my girlfriend, who looked back at me with a confused expression. We all stopped in our tracks, listening for any signs of more thunder. It was quiet for a moment before the second boom hit, followed by another and then another. That's when the feeling in my stomach shifted from curiosity to unease. We turned around and started walking back, now with a little more urgency in our steps. The air felt heavier, and I noticed the trees around us seemed to sway more than usual. The gusts were picking up, and I could feel the wind start to sting my face as it kicked up pine needles and dirt. I didn't say anything at first, but I could tell that my sister and girlfriend were starting to sense it too. It was the wind that really gave it away. This wasn't just some passing breeze. It was strong, like something out of a storm, pushing against us with an unrelenting force. The booms were louder now, and it didn't take long before we all realized something was seriously wrong. I looked up just in time to see the tops of the trees around us begin to sway dangerously. They looked like they were bending in ways that didn't seem natural. That's when I understood what was happening. It wasn't thunder we were hearing. It wasn't some distant storm rolling in. No, what we were hearing was the sound of massive pine trees being torn from the earth, crashing down around us. It wasn't the sound of rain or wind. It was the sound of nature going into a frenzy. "Run!" I shouted, my voice barely above the wind now. "Run! Get out of here!" My heart was racing as adrenaline kicked in. The trail we had just walked on was now a gauntlet, with massive trees beginning to fall one after another, crashing through the forest like they were nothing more than matchsticks. I grabbed my girlfriend's hand, and we broke into a run. My sister was a few steps behind, her feet pounding the dirt with the kind of urgency that only fear can provide. The wind howled in my ears, and I could feel the ground tremble beneath me every time another tree hit the earth. I stole a quick glance over my shoulder. In that moment, I saw a huge pine tree topple just feet behind us, the thick trunk snapping like a twig as it crashed to the ground. My sister was just a few steps ahead of it, and I couldn't believe how close it had come to her. She didn't even seem to notice. We kept running, the trail now nearly impossible to follow as the trees fell all around us. Branches cracked and splintered, the sound deafening, drowning out everything else. Pine needles and debris flew through the air, hitting us like sharp little daggers. The gusts of wind were so strong now that it felt like we were fighting against something far more powerful than we were prepared for. I remember seeing a huge tree fall to the right, just as my sister ran past it. The massive trunk hit the ground with a sickening thud, and I felt a brief surge of terror. If she had been a few seconds slower, it would have crushed her. But somehow, she made it past, her steps fast and frantic. The whole forest seemed to be alive with the sound of falling trees. It was chaos, pure and simple. Every time I looked around, I could see another tree crashing down, and I kept expecting one to fall directly on us. The noise was almost unbearable now, like being trapped inside a drum as it was hammered from all sides. I don't know how long we ran, but it felt like an eternity. My legs were burning, and the air was thick with dust and the sharp scent of pine. Every step felt heavier, but we kept going, not daring to stop, not daring to look back. The only thing that mattered was getting out of the forest, away from the falling trees, away from whatever was causing this madness. When we finally broke free of the tree line and stumbled back to the clearing, we all collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Our clothes were covered in dirt, our faces stinging from the wind and debris. We looked back toward the forest, and that's when we realized just how close we had come to being caught. It took a while for our hearts to stop racing. We sat there in silence, catching our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The wind was still howling, but it was starting to die down, and the sky overhead was darker now, clouds gathering like a storm was finally going to break. The adrenaline was wearing off, and that's when we all started to really feel it. The weight of what had almost happened, the danger we had just escaped. The next day, we decided to try again. This time, we weren't going to be so naive. We'd learned our lesson. We hiked the full trail, and when we reached the spot where we had turned around the day before, we counted 25 trees that had fallen across the trail. Some were huge, blocking the entire path, while others were smaller but still impressive in their destruction. It was surreal to think that just the day before, we had been right in the middle of it all. We kept our pace slow, careful to avoid any fallen branches and debris, but it was hard not to keep glancing up at the sky, wary of any sudden gusts of wind or more booms from the forest. The quiet after the storm felt almost unnatural, like the forest was still recovering from its own fury. But we made it to the end of the trail without incident. We were all exhausted, both physically and mentally, and the quiet after the storm made everything feel that much more real. We'd faced something out there, something powerful and terrifying, and we had survived. It's one of those moments that sticks with you long after it's over. I think back on it sometimes, the sound of those trees falling, and the rush of running for our lives. Montana was everything we hoped it would be, but that day, it taught us a harsh lesson. You never know what can happen when you're out there, far from help and surrounded by the wild, and you don't always have time to turn back. I had been planning this trip for a while, an escape from the noise, the constant grind of life, and the people who never seemed to understand the need to just get away. The Red River Gorge area in Kentucky was a perfect place to go. It had that mix of wilderness that felt untouched but was close enough to civilization if you needed it. I had read about the long dead-end gravel road that led to a lookout spot, and although there were no camping signs near the cliffs, I knew of a primitive campground half a mile back. Perfect, or so I thought. I pulled up my motorcycle to the campground, which was nothing more than a small dirt patch surrounded by trees. It wasn't too busy that night, and I was the only one in the area, which suited me fine. It was late, and the sun had already dipped behind the horizon. I was tired from the ride, but I figured I'd set up my hammock and enjoy the peace. I tied the straps around 2 sturdy trees, settling in, my head leaning back against the soft fabric. I could hear the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, and the faint hum of wind through the trees. It was the perfect kind of quiet that made you forget about everything else. By midnight, I was fully relaxed in the hammock, eyes half closed. The stars were clear above, the sky so vast that it almost felt like you could reach out and touch them. I could have easily drifted off to sleep right then, but something made me uneasy. It was hard to pin down, just a strange feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I shook it off. I was just being paranoid, nothing more. Then I heard it, the sound of tires on gravel, slow but deliberate, coming up the road from the direction of the overlook. It wasn't unusual to hear the occasional vehicle at night, but something about this felt off. It was the way the car was moving, too slow, almost like it was trying to be quiet. I stayed still in my hammock, not wanting to draw attention to myself, but curiosity got the best of me. I strained my ears, listening to the sound of the tires crunching against the gravel, the engine humming steadily as it passed by my campsite. It sounded like it was heading toward the overlook, and then, after a few moments, it stopped. I couldn't hear anything anymore, not even the engine. It was so quiet. I wondered if the car had just stopped to enjoy the view or if it had turned off to rest. I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care. I just hoped they weren't planning to stay for long. But then, about 15 minutes later, everything changed. There was a single gunshot. I had been lying there, drifting into that peaceful state where nothing mattered, when the sharp crack of a rifle split the night air. It was a sound that didn't belong in the stillness of the woods, and my heart skipped a beat. I froze, my mind racing. A gunshot this late, and so close? It was too much of a coincidence for me to ignore. I listened, my breath shallow, as I waited for any sound that might follow it. But nothing came. The silence was absolute. Then, just as suddenly as the gunshot had come, I heard the car again. This time it was speeding back down the road. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, but it was no longer the slow, deliberate pace from before. Whoever was driving was in a rush, and it made my stomach turn. The car sped down the road, kicking up dust and stones as it went, the engine revving louder than before. I heard it take a sharp turn onto the main highway, its engine roaring as it vanished into the night. I lay in the hammock for a long time after that, my heart still pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What had I just heard? A gunshot in the middle of nowhere, followed by a car that seemed to be in a hurry to leave? Something wasn't right. But what could I do? I wasn't going to go looking for answers in the dark, and I wasn't about to get tangled up in something I couldn't understand. It felt like one of those things that should have just stayed in the back of my mind, forgotten, but I couldn't let it go. My thoughts raced through every possible scenario. Was it hunters? Were they doing something illegal? Was someone in trouble? The possibilities spun in my head like a whirlwind, but no answers came. I didn't sleep well that night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves, felt like a warning. I stayed awake for hours, my eyes glued to the entrance of the camp, hoping that nothing would come through it. The next morning, I felt drained, exhausted from lack of sleep, but I packed up my things anyway. I knew I had to get going, continue my ride, clear my head, and try to put whatever happened the night before behind me. As I packed my gear onto my motorcycle, the peacefulness of the woods seemed to mock me. The birds were singing, the air was cool and crisp, and the whole world seemed completely unchanged. But in my mind, everything had shifted. I decided to stop by the ranger station before leaving, mostly to fill up my water bottles. I wasn't sure if I should say anything about the gunshot, about the car, about the feeling I couldn't shake. But the words slipped out anyway. When I mentioned hearing the gunshot, the ranger's face didn't change much, but there was something in their eyes, something cautious. They told me they would check it out, but it didn't feel reassuring. It was clear they had heard something like this before. "You're the second person to mention something like that this week," the ranger said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "We'll look into it." That was it. No further explanation, no reassurances. They didn't seem surprised, didn't seem overly concerned. But I knew whatever was going on out there wasn't something that could be easily explained. I left the ranger station and got back on my motorcycle, but the weight of what I'd heard lingered in my mind like a cloud. Couldn't shake it. I couldn't forget the gunshot, the car speeding off like it had something to hide. I thought about going back to check the area where I'd heard it all. Maybe I could find something, a clue, some kind of sign that would tell me what had happened, but I didn't. Part of me felt like I'd be better off not knowing. And so, I continued on my way, heading towards the next stop on my journey, my mind still racing. What I had experienced that night, it didn't feel like a coincidence. It didn't feel like something I could just brush off. A gunshot in the middle of nowhere, car speeding away, the ranger's strange reaction. It was enough to leave a lingering doubt, a sense that the world was a lot darker than it seemed on the surface. I still don't know who was in that car, or why they shot that gun, or what exactly was going on up there at the overlook. I don't know if I'll ever find out, but I do know this, it was real, and it's something I won't ever forget. It was late, well past dark, really. The kind of dark that swallows everything around you, the kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face even if you tried. I was high up in the Idaho wilderness, above 9,000 feet. I had set up camp by an alpine lake, the water still and silent in the cold mountain air. The only sound was the rustling of the trees, the occasional gust of wind cutting through the evergreens, and my own tired breaths. The day had been tough. Not one of those peaceful, soul-cleansing hikes you see on Instagram where the sun sets just perfectly over a distant peak. It was the kind of day where every step felt like an eternity, where the terrain was rough and unrelenting, and you could feel your body protesting every time you took a step. By the time I got to the lake, I was exhausted mentally, physically, everything. The kind of tired where all you want is to curl up in your sleeping bag and not move until morning. But I needed water. I wasn't the type to take chances with dehydration, especially in the backcountry, so I had to filter some. I stumbled down to the water's edge, grateful that there was no moon to light up the steep slopes surrounding me. The darkness was complete, an impenetrable blanket. I fumbled with my gear, trying to get my Sawyer squeeze set up, but my hands felt numb and shaky from the long day. I remember thinking that everything was peaceful, quiet, still, too still. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the kind of quiet that happens right before something goes horribly wrong. Then I saw it. First, it was just a glint, a brief flash of light that caught my eye. It was way up the side of the mountain, too high for anything that shouldn't be there. The walls of rock rose sharply, mostly cliffs with a bit of loose talus here and there. There wasn't much up there except for the occasional mountain goat or sheep, and even those were rare. The glint was faint, almost like a reflection of something, maybe a sliver of light bouncing off an animal's eye. It was distant, but it was there and it was moving. I squinted into the darkness, trying to figure out what I was looking at. It wasn't a car light. No, the trail I had been on all day was way too remote for that. It wasn't anything I recognized, but I couldn't help but keep watching, unable to tear my gaze away. I couldn't see the body of whatever it was, just the occasional flash of an eye, high up, moving steadily downward. It was coming towards me, down the cliffside, moving quickly, too smoothly for anything that should be on that steep, rocky slope. I had a sinking feeling in my gut. I knew there were predators around here, mountain lions, black bears, maybe even a moose or two. But this felt different. The speed at which whatever it was moved made me feel small, vulnerable. The more I watched it, the more I realized it wasn't a bear. The movement was too fluid, too deliberate. My mind raced. A mountain lion? No, it couldn't be. I had seen lions before, had been in the wilderness long enough to know their habits. But this was different. I had heard stories about lions stalking people, about how they would sometimes follow you for miles, just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. They were patient, silent, the very thing that made them so dangerous. My brain was going into overdrive now. The more I thought about it, the more I was sure it was a lion. Nothing else moved like that. I began to panic. Couldn't help it. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself except my fists, and I was alone. The only thing I had on me was my headlamp, which was flickering and losing battery, and my Sawyer squeeze, which seemed laughable now. My heart was pounding in my chest as I watched the reflection of that eye draw closer, the dim glow from my headlamp only making it more eerie. It had to be a lion, I told myself. A lion moving down the cliffside, down towards me. I tried to remind myself that I knew what to do if it was a lion. Don't turn your back, don't run, make yourself big, stay calm. But none of those things helped the knot in my stomach. The thought of a lion creeping up on me, stalking me, getting closer and closer while I was totally unprepared, was enough to paralyze me with fear. I knew how quick they could be, how deadly. One wrong move and I could be done. I didn't have time to think any more about what to do. My brain was already screaming at me to move, but I couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, watching, waiting. Then finally I saw it. For the first time, the reflection of the eye stopped, and the creature stepped into my dimming headlamp's light. It was huge. I could see its shape now, a large silhouette, but it wasn't a mountain lion. It was a mule deer doe. I stood there, blinking in disbelief. I had been ready to die, convinced that a mountain lion was stalking me, and it was a deer, a doe. A damn muley doe, probably out for a drink at the lake just like me. I had spent so much time in the wilderness, had faced so many different kinds of animals, but I had never been so terrified of something so mundane. My hands were shaking, and I felt lightheaded, my pulse still racing in my neck. I hadn't realized how hard I was breathing until I finally exhaled, a long, shaky breath. The doe, completely unbothered by my presence, stepped closer to the water. I still couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was so normal, so completely harmless, and yet I had just convinced myself it was a killer stalking me. I took a step back, still trying to process what had just happened. The doe didn't seem to care about me at all. It lowered its head to drink from the water, and for a moment, everything was quiet again. I stood there, still in shock, for what felt like an eternity. My mind slowly started to calm down, but the adrenaline was still buzzing in my veins. My heart rate started to slow, but it wasn't until the doe lifted its head and bounded off into the woods that I felt anything close to relief. I couldn't help but laugh a little, a nervous chuckle that sounded out of place in the stillness of the night. I looked around, trying to gather my thoughts, but everything still felt off. I had never been so scared of something that wasn't dangerous. I thought back to the mountain lion encounters I'd had over the years, the bears, the moose, and all the other wild creatures I'd crossed paths with in my time out here. I had never been this shaken by an animal before, but this had been different. It wasn't the animal. It wasn't the situation. It was me. I had been too tired, too worn out. The altitude had gotten to me, and the isolation had worked its magic on my mind. I had let my imagination run wild, and it had almost cost me a whole night of sleep. But even as I stood there, catching my breath, I couldn't shake the image of the lion. The way the eyes had reflected in the dark, the way the shape had moved so quickly down the mountain. My brain had turned a simple shadow into a threat, and it had nearly broken me. I slowly picked up my gear and walked back to my tent, shaking my head. I didn't even finish filtering the water. I was done. My headlamp flickered one last time before going out, and I fumbled for my spare batteries. The whole experience had left me rattled, and I had no desire to stay up any longer. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the adrenaline had worn off, but the weirdness of the encounter stuck with me. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't a big deal, that I was just exhausted and overreacting, but something about it still bothered me. I had faced real danger before. I had been in situations where my life was actually at risk, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. I hadn't just been scared. I had been terrified of something that wasn't even a threat. That night, as I lay in the darkness of my tent, I realized something. It wasn't the animals that made the wilderness scary. It was the way the mind can play tricks on you when you're alone, tired, and far from anything familiar. And in that moment, I wasn't sure which was worse, the fear of the unknown or the fear of my own imagination. But either way, I wasn't going back to that lake to filter water at night again anytime soon. It was the kind of morning where the air was still thick with the promise of dawn, the kind of quiet that you only get when you're miles from anywhere. I was hiking solo as I often did, I'd been on the trail since the previous day, winding my way through a remote section of the wilderness that I knew well but hadn't visited in a few years. The weight of the pack on my back was familiar, but the tension of being alone out here, miles from the nearest road or trailhead, always left a hollow feeling in my chest. Not fear exactly, but more like a sense of being completely out of place, even though I chose to be here. I was moving slow, my headlamp lighting the trail just a few feet in front of me. I knew the terrain well enough to navigate without needing to focus too much, but there's something about the early hours before the sun fully rises that messes with your senses. The shadows are long and deep, and the trees and rocks all look unfamiliar, even though you've seen them 1,000 times. The usual sounds of nature hadn't started up yet, and that felt wrong. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I was about an hour into my hike, just barely awake, when I saw it, a pair of eyes, reflecting back at me from the darkness. It was easy to miss. If I hadn't had the headlamp on, I don't think I would have noticed it at all. It was low to the ground, the kind of height that made me think of a large animal. At first, I thought it might have been a deer, but the eyes were too wide, too round, too unnerving. They didn't reflect like the eyes of a deer do. These were different, intense, and they were staring directly at me. I froze. I could feel my heart picking up speed in my chest, the adrenaline starting to course through me. It was the kind of reaction you get when you're about to experience something you know you're not prepared for. But I wasn't exactly scared, just aware. Very aware that I was completely alone, that there was nothing between me and whatever this creature was except my own 2 feet. The eyes didn't move, just watched me. I took a step back, then another, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being sized up, like I was the one being watched, not the other way around. I didn't make any sudden moves, trying to keep the sound of my breath steady as I slowly lowered the beam of my headlamp, trying to get a better look. That's when I saw it. The shape of a large cat, its body low to the ground, hidden mostly by the underbrush. The eyes, glowing like twin lanterns in the dark, were set in a face that looked almost interested. It was a mountain lion. I'd heard about mountain lion sightings on the trail before, but I'd never seen one up close. At least not this close. I didn't know what to do. In the back of my mind, I knew that running was out of the question. I'd seen the documentaries, heard the stories. If I ran, I'd be prey. But standing there, staring at the creature that stood between me and the world I knew, I felt the primal urge to bolt. But I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself, my body still twitching with tension. I was a bit surprised by how calm I was, how controlled my movements felt. Part of me expected to panic, but instead, I just focused on breathing. The mountain lion didn't seem to mind me at all. It didn't seem in any hurry to get away either. It just kept its steady gaze on me as it shifted slightly, its sleek body moving with the ease of something that was made for the shadows. For a moment, everything was still. There was no wind, no sound, just the pulse of my heart and the quiet reflection of the lion's eyes in my headlamp. We were both sizing each other up, but it didn't feel like a standoff. It felt like a silent agreement. I wasn't going to attack it, and it wasn't going to attack me. At least not yet. I stayed like that for what felt like minutes, but it was probably only seconds. Eventually, the lion stood up, moving with an effortless grace that almost made me forget how dangerous it could be. It turned its head, slowly, and started to move away, its tail swishing like a pendulum, its body low and fluid. It didn't look back. It just left. For a while, I stayed frozen in place, watching the spot where it had been. My mind was racing. What had just happened? Why had it approached me at all? Was I just another part of its territory? Or had it been curious, wondering what I was doing there? As the adrenaline started to wear off, I realized something. I was alone. Really alone. Out here, with only a headlamp and the clothes on my back. In a part of the wilderness where help wasn't just a phone call away. It was miles, hours, or days away. If anything had gone wrong, if that mountain lion had decided that I was more interesting as dinner than as an observer, there would have been nothing to stop it. Nothing at all. I wasn't scared, but I was certainly aware. That awareness settled in like a quiet dread, not in the moment, but in the aftermath. Being alone with nature, surrounded by its raw beauty and its silent, lurking dangers, makes you realize how fragile human existence really is. One slip, one wrong move, and everything could change in an instant. I stood there for a while longer, my headlamp's light gradually fading as the first light of dawn began to creep in. The forest was still quiet, but I knew that wasn't going to last. The day was coming, and with it, the sounds of the wilderness would start up again. The wind, the birds, the rustling of leaves. It wasn't over. Not yet. I didn't hang around to second-guess myself or take more chances. Slowly, I backed away from the spot where I'd encountered the lion, keeping my eyes on the ground, on the trees, on anything that might shift or make a sound. Couldn't let my guard down yet. As the minutes passed, I found myself thinking more about the lion. Not about how close I'd come to danger, but about how calm it had been, how it had just done its thing without feeling threatened by me. The idea of it, so silently powerful, so capable, was something I could never fully shake off. Eventually, I made it to the next bend in the trail, where the trees opened up and the sun finally poked over the horizon. The world started to come alive again, and with that, the tension in my chest eased. I still had hours of hiking ahead of me, but I wasn't thinking about the lion anymore. I wasn't thinking about anything except the trail under my feet and the quiet morning air. But somewhere deep inside, I knew that the feeling I had when I saw those glowing eyes would stay with me for a long time. It wasn't fear, but something more unsettling. The knowledge that, out here in the wilderness, anything could happen. I was just a visitor, a small part of a much larger, much older world. And for all my preparation, for all the gear I carried and the experience I had, I was never really in control. In the end, the lion had been just that, a big cat doing what it does. But for me, it was a reminder that the wilderness is indifferent to us. Out here, you can only hope that whatever crosses your path is as uninterested in you as you are in it. The sun was dipping low over Lake Louise, casting a golden glow over the rugged landscape as my brother and I made our way up the trail. We'd been hiking for most of the day, starting early in the morning, and now we were about to crest a ridge that would give us an amazing view of the lake below. Our packs were heavy, and our legs were starting to feel the burn of the long hike, but we were both experienced enough to know that this was just part of the deal when you're hiking in the Canadian Rockies. The beauty of it all made it worth the effort. We were making our way along a narrow path that wound its way up a steep incline. The rocks underfoot a bit slippery with the morning dew that hadn't quite dried off. The air was thin up here, but I was used to it by now, having done my fair share of hiking in these mountains. My brother, who was a bit younger but no less experienced, was slightly ahead of me. We often had this unspoken understanding between us. I'd be the one to lead when things got tough, but he would always push forward and make sure we were going at a pace we could both handle. We reached the crest of the ridge together. The view was incredible, just like I remembered it. The deep blue of Lake Louise shimmered far below, surrounded by towering peaks that seemed to stretch on forever. It was moments like these that made the tough hikes feel worth it. We paused to catch our breath and take in the scene before moving on. I was about to take a step forward when something in the distance caught my eye. My brother was still admiring the view, not noticing, but I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air felt different, heavier somehow, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I looked down the path, which was a bit more of a ledge than I remembered. It wasn't a sheer cliff, but it had a steep drop on one side, and the path itself was narrow. And then I saw it. A mama grizzly bear, massive and intimidating, was sitting directly on the path, not even 20 feet down from where we stood. I couldn't tell exactly how big she was, but I knew she was a beast. I'd seen grizzlies before, once from a distance on another hike, but this one was something else. She looked like she weighed close to 1,000 pounds, her fur thick and matted with dirt, and her massive head turned slowly to look at us. Her eyes locked onto mine with a kind of intensity one can't quite describe. Everything in my body froze. The kind of freeze you get when you know something is wrong, but you can't move. Her gaze held steady, and in that moment, I knew she was sizing us up. I've never felt anything quite like it before, the awareness that we were being judged. It wasn't like how you might feel if you saw a deer in the distance or even a moose. No, this was different. This was the kind of gaze that spoke of survival. She wasn't looking at us like a curiosity. She wasn't looking at us with fear. She was sizing us up as a potential threat. I looked over at my brother, and I could tell he saw it too. His face had gone pale, and I could see the tension in his posture as he slowly started to back up without saying a word. I knew what we had to do. There was no chance in hell we were going to just walk past this bear and her cubs. We had to get out of there. We backed up as quietly as we could, taking deliberate, slow steps, never breaking eye contact with the bear. I could hear my own breath, loud in my ears, as I focused on keeping calm. Panic was the last thing we needed. In that moment, I was acutely aware of how fragile our situation could be. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything could change. We backed up about 20 yards, staying on the path, still keeping our eyes on the bear, and then turned to the side, making our way along the ridge to a point where we could wait. We waited for what felt like an eternity. The whole time, the adrenaline was coursing through me. I don't know how long we stood there, maybe 15 minutes, maybe more, but it felt like hours. We didn't talk. We didn't make any noise. Every so often, I'd glance over at my brother, and he'd look back at me, both of us silently agreeing that we weren't going back down there until we knew the bear and her cubs had moved on. We'd been in the mountains long enough to know how unpredictable wildlife could be. Bears were not something you took lightly. Everyone talks about how you should be cautious around them, how you should make noise to avoid surprising them. But this situation was different. We weren't in a heavily trafficked area, and we hadn't seen anyone on the trail for the past couple of hours. This bear had no reason to feel threatened by us other than our presence in her space. She might have been protecting her cubs, or maybe she just felt we were too close to them. Either way, she wasn't making any moves. She was just watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. After what felt like forever, we finally decided to move back. I checked the area around us once again, scanning the ridgeline and the forest that stretched beyond, but there was no sign of the bear. The path was still empty, as if nothing had happened. We turned back to the spot where we had first seen the bear. The air felt thinner, colder somehow, like it had lost some of its warmth while we waited. Our hearts were still racing, but we knew we couldn't stay on edge forever. We stepped carefully back toward the ledge, trying to move as quietly as possible, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the thick earth and rocks. As we got closer to the place where we'd seen the bear, the tension in the air had lessened, but there was still something unsettling about it all. We both knew that grizzlies could be unpredictable, and our hearts were still pounding, though we were trying to tell ourselves everything would be fine. When we got to the spot, we looked around. The bear and her cubs were gone. There was no sign of them at all, no tracks, no movement. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The path was empty, and the silence felt eerie, like the whole world was holding its breath. We didn't say much after that. We just continued down the path, walking carefully and keeping our distance from the edge. I kept looking around, making sure I didn't miss anything, but there was no sign of the bear. The only thing that marked the spot where we'd seen her was the lingering memory of those intense, unblinking eyes, and the feeling that we had narrowly avoided a confrontation that could have ended very differently. We made it back to the main trail without incident, and after a while, I finally let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My brother and I didn't need to talk about it. We both knew how close we had come to a dangerous situation. The mountain had reminded us of how wild it still was, how easily things could go wrong when you weren't paying attention. By the time we made it back to the parking lot, the sky was darkening, and the last light of the day was fading. We didn't hang around much longer. We packed up our gear and headed out, driving in silence for the most part. There was nothing more to say. We had both learned something in those few minutes we'd spent backing away from that bear. Sometimes, it's the moments you don't expect that can be the most dangerous. And sometimes you just have to listen to that gut feeling and get out of there before things go south. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of thunder that shook the ground, even through the heavy sleep in my bones. At first, I thought it was a dream or some crazy mix of noise in the dense forest, but the storm's anger only grew as I came to my senses. The wind hit hard enough to rattle my tent. The rain came next, a torrent that hammered against the fabric like someone throwing gravel at it. I lay there for a moment, frozen in disbelief. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had come out here to get away from it all. The noise, the rush of daily life, the distractions of the world. I needed solitude, wanted to be swallowed up by the quiet of the forest, to feel like nothing could touch me. But now I was trapped, miles away from anyone, deep in the trees, in the middle of the kind of storm I'd only seen on weather reports. The lightning was the first thing that really hit me. It wasn't the occasional flash either, but constant, relentless streaks that lit up the sky in a way that made me question if the trees were going to catch fire. Each bolt of lightning revealed just how alive the forest was. I'd known these woods my whole life. This was my hometown after all. But it had always been the peaceful kind of alive. Now it was alive with fear, with a ferocity I hadn't seen before. I could hear trees snapping and crashing down all around me, like they were being torn apart by something stronger than any force I'd ever felt. My stomach dropped. I'd been camping here for a few days, a solo backpacking trip to clear my head. I had gotten used to the towering pines, the endless sea of trunks. Trees had always been a bit of a fear of mine, a constant unease that crept in whenever I was around them, but I had pushed through it before. I always hated how they crowded me, how they seemed to watch me. But now, with the storm ripping through the woods, that fear felt a lot more real. Every crack of thunder made the trees around me tremble. Every gust of wind made them lean in, creaking and groaning like they were going to fall on me any second. And then came the snapping sounds. Trees weren't supposed to snap like that. Not here. Not in these woods. The forest should have been quiet, should have been alive with birds and insects, not with the chaos of wind and the gut-wrenching sounds of dying trees. I sat up in my tent, heart hammering in my chest, eyes wide as the storm raged on. There was nothing I could do but wait it out, but I couldn't stop myself from checking the surroundings. The last thing I wanted was a tree coming down on top of me. I'd seen it happen before to other campers, heard the stories. When the trees came down, they didn't make a sound at first. It was the wind that was loud. By the time you heard a tree coming for you, it was already too late. I fumbled for my headlamp, which had slipped under my sleeping bag during the night. The rain was already soaking through my tent, and I felt the cold creeping in around my legs. There was no chance I'd get any sleep with the wind howling like that. The lightning was too bright, flashing in through the tiny gaps in my tent, illuminating the trees in harsh, surreal bursts. It felt like the world had been cut into jagged pieces, each bolt of lightning carving a new shape in the forest that I could barely process before the light went away and left me with darkness again. I held my breath, straining to listen. The forest was loud with the storm's fury, but beyond the wind, I could hear it, the groaning of the trees. It was like a warning, like they were shifting and shuddering with a deep, guttural growl. I couldn't tell which trees were snapping, couldn't even tell if the ones closest to me were the ones in danger. But they were all leaning in, all swaying too far to feel safe. My head was spinning. I thought about getting out of my tent, running out into the storm, but that felt like an even worse option. I'd have no shelter. I'd have to navigate through dense trees, which were likely to come down, and if I wasn't careful, I might run straight into one that was about to fall. Every instinct told me to stay put, to wait and ride out the storm, but the fear in my chest only grew stronger. What if I wasn't safe in here? What if the wind blew a tree my way? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the dark outline of the trees in the distance, listening to the storm rip through the canyon. The wind wasn't just a breeze anymore. It was a howl, a relentless scream that threatened to tear everything apart. The rain hammered at my tent, and the sound of thunder was like the roar of some great beast in the sky. I tried to focus on something else, anything else, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the sound of trees snapping and the rush of the wind filled my mind. The images were there, two trees toppling over in a blur, crushing everything in their path. I could almost feel the earth beneath me shaking with the power of it. The storm seemed to be getting worse. I had never seen lightning like this before. It wasn't just the frequent flashes. This was something different, something wild and uncontrollable. The sky seemed to light up every few seconds, and each bolt seemed to stretch down from the heavens with a vengeance. I tried to think back to any weather training I'd gotten over the years, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a normal storm. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it, a loud, sharp crack. A tree was coming down. I was frozen for a moment. My eyes were wide, straining to see through the dim light. I couldn't pinpoint the exact location, but I could hear it, feel it. A deep, low rumble in the earth, and then a massive, violent crash. My heart raced. The ground trembled slightly with the impact, but I couldn't tell where it had fallen. My breath caught in my throat. If that tree had fallen close enough, I wouldn't have stood a chance. I shifted, sliding my hand along the edge of the tent, trying to gauge the direction of the sound, but it was impossible to know. Every time I thought the storm was about to calm, another gust of wind would tear through the trees, making the whole world shudder again. The trees creaked louder now, as if they were in pain. I had to move. I had to do something. I grabbed my pack, careful not to make a noise that might give away my panic, and began to crawl out of the tent. The rain was relentless, and as soon as I stepped out into the storm, I felt the full force of it. The wind whipped my face, and the water stung like needles. I pulled my hood tight and tried to focus to get my bearings. The lightning was blinding now. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, and the wind was so strong that it felt like it might knock me off my feet at any moment. The trees were swaying violently, their branches snapping like broken bones. Every gust of wind brought with it the sound of something breaking. I was trapped. There was no other word for it. I couldn't stay in the tent. The trees might fall and I might not get out alive, but I couldn't stay out here in the storm either. The ground was slippery, the rocks sharp beneath my boots. Every step felt like it was going to send me tumbling. I couldn't think straight. My heart pounded in my chest, and the sound of the storm swallowed everything else. My mind was spinning in circles, trying to figure out what to do, where to go. But it wasn't until I heard another tree crack, this one much closer than the last, that I knew I couldn't waste another second. I ran. I don't know why I thought running was the answer. Maybe it was the adrenaline kicking in, or maybe it was the fear of the trees crashing down on me that pushed me forward. But I ran, deeper into the forest, away from my tent, away from the place that felt like it might collapse under the storm's wrath. The wind pushed me from behind, as if urging me onward. I could barely see, but I knew I had to keep moving. The ground was uneven, and the trees around me seemed to lean in closer with every step, like they were trying to pull me into their embrace. The snap of a branch above made me jump, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, I stumbled upon a small clearing, sheltered by a thick wall of pine trees on three sides. The wind still screamed, but it was quieter here, more bearable. The trees around me were standing tall, holding their ground, and I knew I had found some small measure of safety. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, soaked to the bone, shaking uncontrollably from both the cold and the fear. The storm raged on, but I knew I had made it through the worst of it. The trees around me were still standing, for now. I could hear them creaking and groaning, but the worst was over. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't, but I stayed in that clearing, feeling the storm's wrath rip through the forest, knowing that somehow I had survived. It wasn't a victory over nature. It wasn't some triumph of survival, but it was enough. The storm passed. By morning, the sky was a pale, washed-out blue. The trees stood tall, battered but not broken. The air was thick with the scent of wet wood and earth. I packed up my camp and started the long trek back home, my feet heavy with exhaustion, my mind still trying to process the night. But one thing was certain, I would never look at trees the same way again. It was one of those days when everything seemed off. The wind was howling through the trees like it had a personal grudge against the world, and rain had been coming down in sheets for hours. The trail, which had been tough but manageable in the morning, had become slick and treacherous as I pushed north, somewhere near the border between Idaho and Montana. I had started the day optimistic, but the weather was starting to wear me down, and the constant drumming of raindrops on my rain jacket made it hard to focus. I was alone on the Continental Divide Trail as I had been for weeks, and the isolation was starting to feel heavier. The trees around me, tall and ancient, swayed under the relentless wind. Their thick trunks were an imposing presence in the misty forest, their boughs creaking as if they were whispering warnings. A sudden gust of wind pushed at my back, and I instinctively crouched a bit lower, hugging the trail's edge where the forest thinned out. But even here, the trees were packed close, leaning over the trail like guardians. At first, it was just another gust, another wave of rain pelting against my hood. But then, I heard something, a noise I couldn't immediately identify. It sounded like a large crack, a splintering sound, followed by the heavy thud of something crashing into the earth. For a split second, I froze, unsure of what had just happened. I stood still, the rain slapping my face as I scanned my surroundings. And then I saw it. A massive pine tree ahead of me, easily 70 feet tall, was tilting in a way that didn't seem possible. It wasn't the typical sway of trees in the wind. No, this tree was falling, and it was falling directly across the trail in my path. The crown of the tree, which had been swaying with the gusts, now angled downward with frightening speed. My brain had a hard time understanding what I was seeing. It was like time had slowed, and yet my mind couldn't quite catch up with the reality in front of me. I took a couple of steps back, my heart racing. My brain finally clicked into action, processing the danger as the tree continued to tilt, its weight shifting with terrible certainty. The sound of cracking would intensify, and I realized just how massive this tree was. It wasn't a small pine. It was an old, thick trunk, its branches spread out like arms, blocking everything in its path. My eyes darted along the trail. There was nowhere to go. The tree was falling fast, and I was right in its way. It was one of those moments where everything else seemed to disappear. The wind and rain blurred into the background. There was no time for panic, no time for hesitation. It was pure instinct, the kind of instinct that can save your life or doom you. I don't know why, but in that moment, my mind flashed to the movie Prometheus. I remembered the scene with the giant wheel-like object chasing the characters. They ran, but they didn't get out of the way. They just veered to the side, out of its direct path. I didn't know why that moment popped into my head, but something in me knew that was what I needed to do. With no time to think further, I turned and darted to the side of the trail, my legs pumping harder than they had in days. I glanced back as I heard the tree splinter. The sound was deafening. The tree hit the ground with a thunderous crack, its branches snapping and splintering as it landed lengthwise down the trail. The broken section of the tree that had fallen was easily 60 feet long, and its wide trunk sprawled across the path, blocking the trail completely. The sheer weight and size of the tree were incomprehensible, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me that I had avoided being crushed. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, my heart still hammering in my chest. The wind continued to howl, and the rain was relentless, but I was alive. The kind of relief that comes with survival is hard to explain. It's a strange mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and adrenaline that leaves you feeling shaken but grateful. I stood there, staring at the massive pine now lying across the trail, the silence settling in around me. But then, my mind snapped back into gear. I had to move. I couldn't stand there all day, staring at the tree. The trail had to be navigated somehow. Slowly, I stepped around the fallen tree, keeping my distance from the jagged ends of the broken trunk. As I moved past it, I could feel the weight of what had just happened. One wrong move, 1 second of delay, and I would have been flattened. I didn't linger long, not wanting to tempt fate any further. The trail continued, winding through the forest, but it was hard to shake the feeling of danger still hanging in the air. The rain had only gotten worse, now pouring down in sheets that made everything feel cold and oppressive. The wind pushed at me from all sides, making each step feel like a fight. After a few hours, my mind started to settle back into the rhythm of hiking. But then, another sharp sound pierced through the rain and wind, a rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the wind this time. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. My eyes locked on a large rock outcrop about 20 feet to my right. It wasn't the source of the noise, but something about the rocks made my skin prickle. There was movement, and then a flicker of something slithering near the base of the rocks. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There, curled up against the rocks, was a rattlesnake. It was only a few feet from me, and if I had taken another step forward, I would have walked right into it. The snake was still, but I could hear the faint rattle of its tail, a warning that sent a chill down my spine. I backed away slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves that might provoke it. The snake watched me, its tongue flicking in and out, testing the air. I knew better than to get too close. I took a wide arc around it, giving it plenty of space. The trail ahead was still rough, but the encounter with the snake had left me feeling more alert, more aware of the dangers lurking just out of sight. I moved cautiously, keeping my eyes on the ground and the trees around me. Night was falling, and I knew I'd have to find a place to camp soon. I pushed on through the rain, but the wind was only getting worse. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a ridge, and I set up camp, my mind still racing from the day's events. My tent was a relief, though it didn't offer much protection from the wind. I set up my sleeping bag and huddled inside, listening to the wind howl and the rain beat against the fabric. It felt like the storm was never going to end. Just as I was starting to settle in, I heard something outside my tent. At first, it was a soft rustling, like leaves being brushed aside. But then it got louder. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound was unmistakable now. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I could feel my pulse quicken. I grabbed my bear spray and held it tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps came closer, and then I heard something else. A low growl, like the rumble of a bear. My blood ran cold. I had camped in bear country before, but there was something about this encounter that felt different. I could hear the bear moving around my tent, circling it, its claws scraping against the ground. The growling continued, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. My hand was on the bear spray, but I didn't know if it would be enough if the bear decided to get too close. Minutes stretched on like hours, and the bear continued to circle my tent. I had no way of knowing how close it was, but the growling grew fainter, and then, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of its footsteps faded away into the night. I lay there in the silence, the adrenaline still coursing through me. It took a long time for my breathing to steady, but eventually, I managed to drift off into a restless sleep, every little sound outside my tent making me jump. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun broke through the clouds, and the air smelled fresh, even if the trail was still wet and slick. I packed up my tent, still a little shaken from the night before. I didn't see any sign of the bear, but I wasn't about to take any chances. The trail ahead called to me, but my mind was still heavy with the thoughts of what I had survived the day before. A tree, a rattlesnake, and a bear. If I could make it through all that, maybe the rest of the trail wouldn't seem so daunting. As I hiked on, the trail seemed quieter. The wind had died down, and the forest felt more peaceful. But the memory of the tree falling across the trail stayed with me, a reminder of just how fragile our lives can be when we're at the mercy of nature's power. I walked forward, one step at a time, grateful for the moments of clarity that had saved me, and for the simple fact that I was still alive to tell the tale. We were 4 friends, ready to escape the noise of the world for a weekend. We had planned this trip for weeks, deciding on a secluded spot deep in the woods, away from the hustle and bustle of our regular lives. The weather had been perfect the whole week, and we were excited for a break. Our idea was simple: pack up, hike deep into the woods, and camp for a night or two. Nothing fancy, just us and nature. We arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, and the air had that crisp feeling of the impending evening. We set off, chatting and laughing as we made our way through the woods. The path wasn't particularly difficult, but it was winding and overgrown in places. It felt like we were venturing into some forgotten corner of the forest, the kind of place most people would pass by without giving it a second thought. As we hiked deeper, the woods became denser. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy above, casting the forest floor in a dim, shadowy light. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves were comforting at first, but as the trail grew quieter, I started to feel the weight of isolation settling in. There were no other hikers around, no signs of civilization, just us and the trees. It was the kind of silence that makes you more aware of your own footsteps, your breath, and every little noise in the distance. We reached a clearing just before sunset and decided it would be a good place to set up camp. The ground was flat, and the trees around us provided a decent amount of cover. We got to work setting up our tents and gathering wood for a fire. The task was simple, but it gave me a sense of comfort, knowing we were taking care of everything. The fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows that danced across the trunks of the trees. We sat around it, sharing stories, cracking jokes, and eating simple camp food. It was the perfect end to a day of hiking. As the fire burned low, the conversation drifted into quieter tones. The sounds of the forest, wind through the leaves, the occasional chirp of a cricket, filled the gaps between our words. Eventually, we all grew tired. One by one, we retired to our tents, zipping ourselves inside and pulling the flaps shut against the cool air of the night. I wasn't particularly sleepy, so I lay there in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds of my friends settling into their own tents. The fire outside had died down to embers, leaving a soft glow that barely illuminated the edges of the clearing. I rolled over onto my side, trying to get comfortable, but something about the stillness of the night was making me uneasy. I couldn't explain it. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're alone in the woods at night, away from any help or comfort. That's when I did something I'd never done before. On a whim, I grabbed a long stick from outside my tent, one I had noticed earlier that looked sharp at the end. I thought it might be a good idea to keep it close, just in case. Not that I thought something dangerous would happen, but you never know. I stuck it through the flap of my tent, poking it into the ground just outside. I thought it would be better to have something sharp nearby if, for some strange reason, we needed it. It was a ridiculous idea, I know, but it made me feel a little safer, even though I wasn't sure why. I lay back down, trying to push the odd feeling from my mind. The night stretched on, and I slowly began to doze off, the warmth from the fire and the rhythmic sounds of the forest lulling me into sleep. But just as I was drifting off, I heard something. A crack, a snap, something breaking twigs in the darkness. It was soft at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder. It was like something or someone was moving around outside, near our camp. I held my breath, straining to listen. My mind started racing, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was something much closer, something that didn't belong. The noises continued for a few more minutes. I felt my heart start to race. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just a deer or some other creature moving through the woods. But then I felt something that made my blood run cold. A light tap, something brushed against my feet from outside my tent. It was subtle at first, just a light pressure, like a hand or a branch gently making contact. But it was enough to make me freeze. My mind went into overdrive, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. What in the world had touched my feet? There was no way it was an animal. An animal wouldn't be so precise, so intentional. It felt deliberate. I held still, praying that whatever it was would go away. The minutes felt like hours, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I lay there in the darkness, hoping that my friends were oblivious, that nothing was wrong. But deep down, I knew something was off. The noises outside grew louder, closer. The snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, as if someone, or something, was walking around our campsite. My mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Could it be a person? A hunter, maybe, who wandered off the trail? Or was it something else? I couldn't explain the feeling of dread creeping up my spine, but it was real. I tried to shake it off, but the longer I lay there, the more convinced I became that I wasn't alone in the woods. Eventually, I heard the rustling stop. The air grew still again, and I allowed myself to relax, though only slightly. I wanted to call out to my friends, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I wasn't sure if anyone else had heard anything. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was just the wind after all. But then I heard something else. The unmistakable sound of my stick snapping in half, loud and clear. The stick I had left outside my tent for protection. It was unmistakable. A sharp, distinct crack, followed by the sound of something moving away. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped my tent, my heart pounding in my chest. My friends were still fast asleep in their tents, unaware of what was going on. I had to do something. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out, careful not to wake anyone else. My breath came in quick gasps as I stood up, shining the light around the clearing. I pointed the beam of the flashlight toward the spot where I had left the stick. The light revealed the broken pieces of wood scattered across the ground, twisted and snapped in half as though someone had stepped on it with force. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no traces of a struggle, just the broken stick lying there in the darkness. I stood frozen for a few moments, staring at the broken wood. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. There was no logical explanation for what had just happened. Whoever or whatever had broken my stick was long gone. But the fact that it had happened so close to our camp, without any of us hearing or seeing anything, sent a chill down my spine. I checked the other tents. My friends were still asleep, oblivious to what had just transpired. I stood there for a few minutes longer, scanning the woods around us, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds, just the silent, watchful trees. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure whether I should wake my friends or not. They'd probably think I was overreacting, imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with us. After a while, I made my way back to my tent. I lay there wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. But every noise, every rustle in the trees, made my heart race again. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. Not now. Not after what had happened. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I was on edge the entire time. When morning finally came, I decided to keep the events of the night to myself. My friends were already up, stretching and yawning as they packed up their things, oblivious to the fear I had felt in the darkness. We left the woods the next day without another incident. But as we hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched the entire time. I never found out who or what had touched my feet or broken the stick. And to this day, I still don't know what happened that night in the woods. It's a mystery that still lingers in my mind, an unanswered question that will always stay with me. But one thing is for certain. I'll never forget the way the woods felt that night. The way the silence seemed to press in on me, the feeling of being watched, and the undeniable sense that we weren't alone out there.